All right. I'd just like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd like to acknowledge some of our dignitaries that we have here with us. We have Councillor Frank Breen, we have Councillor Linda Kelly, who is in fact a founding member of Labor for Refugees. We have the Honourable Meredith Bergman, and also Penny Sharp, Helen Westwood and Jeanette McHugh will also be joining us. So thank you to all of those people for being here, and for anybody else who I might have missed in the enormous crowd. Thank you for coming to listen to Julian Burnside launch The Drowning's Argument. This is a book that has been edited by Rodney Rothfield for Labor for Refugees. Now, there may be many in the room who don't actually know who Labor for Refugees are. We're an active group of Labor Party members and trade unionists who are seeking for just and fair Labor Party policy on refugees and asylum seekers. And this is a particularly big year for us because it's the National Party conference in July. So forums such as this are very important in terms of our momentum towards building towards a better position at the National Conference in July. So thank you for being here. I was reminded by Nizza that we do want to get your details, so please sign the attendance sheet, and particularly if you're if you're interested in being involved with Labor for Refugees, please sign up at the end of the meeting and come and talk to some of the volunteers and representatives of Labor for Refugees here. My personal journey about one of the reasons I wanted to get so much involved in this issue was that when I was working for the Public Education Foundation, one of the scholarships we ran was a scholarship called the Friends of Zainab Scholarship. And I don't know, there would be some people in this room who've heard of this scholarship. It was started at first by the absolutely wonderful Dorothy Hodnott out at Holroyd High in southwestern Sydney. And it was a scholarship that supported refugee students in years 11 and 12 in order for them to get through high school, and then we often supported them on into their university years as well. And it was through this scholarship that I met so many amazing young people whose stories you could not believe if you weren't hearing them with your own ears. So the one I always remember is Nahid Karimi. So Nahid Karimi, she was a young Afghani woman. She arrived in Australia in September 2001. You can imagine that timing. And she and her family were put into Port Hedland for 8 months before moving to Sydney on temporary protection visas. When she rocked up, aged 13, at Holroyd High School, it was the first formal education experience she had ever had in her life. So before that, she had been homeschooled by her mother in Afghanistan, but she'd never attended a formal school. She knew no English. So you arrive at this big, massive high school in Western Sydney, and this is your first ever experience, and you know no English. Now, Nahid went through the Intensive English Centre. She studied away. She was supported all the time by the amazing teachers out there, supported by the Friends of Zainab Scholarship, and she ended up, within just 5 years, finishing her HSC and matriculating to a Bachelor of Medical Sciences at the University of Western Sydney. You know, and she's not the only one. I mean, you know, Bari Marty, who was this young man, similar sort of thing. And when he rocked up to go to UWS on the first day, because he was still on a temporary protection visa, they said, "Oh, you're an international student, you'll have to pay $100,000 please." So, anyway, point being that you had to pay $100,000 for the degree. That was sorted out, admittedly again by Dorothy mucking around and getting UWS to give him a scholarship. But it is simply ridiculous. It is simply ridiculous. And these are the people who make it through the system. These are the people who actually are lucky enough to reach our shores and then to get the helping hands of all the people who care so much about their future. What happens to the rest of them? So this really, I mean, I don't need to tell this room this, but when Italy experienced the massive deaths of asylum seekers at sea in 2013, when they lost 368 Eritreans and 232 Syrians, drowned in 2 separate incidents, there was a massive public outcry. And how did the Italian government respond? They responded with a new rescue policy. They put in a flotilla of 5 Navy vessels, crewed by more than 850 Navy officers, and have since then, since just 2013, they've saved 10,000 people, including over 600 women and more than 1,000 children. Now, when Australia witnessed a similar sort of tragedy at the shores of Christmas Island, our response was very different. There was no grand rescue strategy. In fact, it was the exact opposite. In fact, all there was a commitment to tougher punitive measures. And it really makes you wonder about the Australian psyche. Like, what is wrong with us? Why is our collective capacity for empathy so bruised? You know, I think it's Pope Francis who says, in a world of globalisation, we have fallen into a globalisation of indifference, making us insensitive to the cries of others. But the thing that you really think when you think about that Christmas Island experience is that people were appalled. Like, I remember it, people were appalled and they were upset by the images. There was a whole lot of public outcry. But what was different was our political response to the public outcry. It's what our leaders said in response to that outcry. And rather than our politicians speaking to people's better angels and using this crisis as an opportunity to gain popular support for more humane refugee practices, which it could have been a galvanising experience, they once again fell into the tried and tested formula of blaming the victims of the tragedy. These were bad refugees. These were refugees who were trying to skip the queue. These were refugees who were so terrible that they callously risked the lives of their children. Now, I was on the far north coast of New South Wales in 2001. I was running the Labor Party election campaign up there and things were looking good. Labor was going well. We were going to storm back into government and win the November election. And then two things occurred. In September, the World Trade Centre was attacked. And then a little bit later, the Tampa sailed into Australian waters. And in an instant, our world changed fundamentally. And it was interesting for me, having come from the inner city of Sydney, because I'll never forget the flood of phone calls coming into the campaign office up in the Tweed Heads, and especially once Tampa was around. The mix of both the World Trade Centre attacks and the Tampa had most of Tweed Heads convinced that the Arabs were about to arrive on our shores. You know, it was just this totally fearful reaction of people on the phone. And we all know that Howard exploited that Tampa incident mercilessly. I mean, I'll never forget driving around the booth on the day of that election, and everyone voted early and they were silent. It was almost as if they felt guilty about what they were about to do. So you'd see all these working class people who worked their whole lives standing in the queue silent next to the giant posters of "We may say who comes into our country and what," and the circumstances under which they came. And I will always blame John Howard for this immoral playing of the race card, because I think it has affected our politics forevermore. And his decision around the Tampa spelt the end of the bipartisan political consensus that had actually existed in Australian politics, especially since the Vietnam War. So when you remember the 80,000 Vietnamese who immigrated to Australia immediately after the Vietnam War, the Fraser government welcomed them, and the Labor opposition welcomed them in a bipartisan consensus. There was no baiting, there was no playing of the race card, there was no playing to people's worser natures. And Howard ended that political consensus. But to the Labor Party's eternal shame, we decided to follow him. It's like we followed him into the abyss. And the absolute kindest interpretation that I can give to our leaders at the time was that they were sensed they were so close to victory that, okay, we'll just follow this and then when we get in we can fix it up. But of course that didn't happen. We didn't win. Our moral authority evaporated, and Australian politics around refugees and asylum seekers entered over a decade of tit for tat and who can best stop the boats sort of politics. And ever since then we've been going downhill. So what do we do now? What can Labor Party politicians do? What can the Labor Party do? What can the community do? Well, as far as the Labor Party is concerned, I believe always that we must be a party of conviction and base our decisions on evidence. And the evidence is clear. We do not have a refugee crisis on our borders. You know, Australia hosts about 1/10 of 1% of the world's refugees, right? 1/10 of 1%. This is not much for a country with some of the lowest population densities and in fact the world's 13th largest economy. We're simply not doing it. The Labor Party should follow the law. We should follow international law. We should take pride. We should take pride in the fact that the Australian Labor Party played a very significant role in the establishment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights under Doc Evatt, and we should own that history. We should own that history and always seek to uphold and promote the law of international human rights. Labor must return to the moral fray and ensure that our policy regarding refugees is in accordance with our country's legal obligations. No ifs, no buts. But what then? What then? How do we then restore bipartisan consensus? How do we stop the Scott Morrisons and the Tony Abbotts from running around the country's marginal seats telling people that the refugees are coming on their doors? And that's, I think, where you come in. That's where organisations like Labour for Refugees and all the people in the room here come in. We need to demand humane refugee policies from all sides of politics. We need to build broad alliances with everyone we can find, you know, with church groups, with civil society, with the traditional media, with social media, in the schools, in the pubs, in the workplaces, in the unions, you know, in the universities. We need to stretch out to the good members in the coalition party on this issue. The aim must be, has to be, to restore consensus, to restore bipartisan consensus on the issue of human rights for asylum seekers. There is so much political goodwill from everyone here today, so much potential to do this. And Labour for Refugees, I just wanted to salute everyone who are the activists who do this work because it's just one part of the puzzle, but it's such an important part of that puzzle. So thank you again for so many of you for coming here today. I will now like to introduce you to the man of the moment, to our keynote speaker, Julian Burnside. I'm sure he needs no introduction, but he's a pretty incredible individual. He's an Australian barrister. He practices principally in commercial litigation, trade practices and administrative law, but he's probably best known for his incredible work as a human rights and refugee advocate and as an author. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Julian.
Thank you very much. I was planning to start by saying I'm very happy to be in Sydney to launch this, but I'm not. I'm always happy to be in Sydney, but I'm not happy to be launching this book for two reasons. First, because of its title and what its title signifies, and second, because such a book is needed at all. What's wrong with the title? Oh, by the way, the empty chair. No.
You want to give it away? Sorry.
I was going to say, no one wants the chair. I was going to say that's a chair for Razor Verity. He can't be here because a year ago and 2 days he was killed in Manus Island in the detention centre, but where he'd been placed as an innocent human being for processing by our government or its contractors. Anyway, why am I unhappy about the title? The Drowning Argument. The Drowning Argument is the title given to my essay, which is the first essay in the book, and I understand that my essay was the prompt for producing the book. My essay was called The Drowning Excuse. It is not an argument, it's an excuse. But I understand from the people who put the book together that internal pressure within the Labor Party forced them to change the drowning excuse to the drowning argument. And the fact that that sort of pressure was brought to bear at all, I think actually characterises the shameful stand of the Labor Party that Verity referred to. It will not surprise you that I agree entirely with Verity that the Labor Party is fatally compromised on the refugee issue. The Labor Party reintroduced offshore processing for the worst possible reasons. I don't know what went wrong with the expert panel, But there was no justification for reintroducing offshore processing and no justification for reintroducing it in a form which involves such terrible abuses of human rights. So that, for example, in Manus Island, after Reza Verity was killed on the 17th of February last year, a Supreme Court judge of the PNG Supreme Court began an own motion inquiry, which he's constitutionally entitled to do under their constitutional Bill of Rights, which we prepared for them on their independence. He began an own motion inquiry into what had been going on in Manus Island, and the government of PNG shut it down. He set up a new own motion inquiry, and they shut that down. And we did not hear a squeak of complaint from Australia on whose behalf the whole catastrophic arrangement is being carried out in Manus Island. Second, one of the major reasons that I would hold Labor equally responsible for what is going on now is because I think, and I could be wrong, but I think what is going on with the treatment of asylum seekers is inconsistent with basic Australian values. I do not believe most Australians are racist. I do not believe most Australians believe in being willfully cruel to human beings. But it's been managed and justified because from the time of Tampa, the Howard government set up the idea that these people are illegals and queue jumpers. And by the way, your chronology is slightly out. I know the Tampa chronology fairly well. The Tampa rescued the 438 asylum seekers on the 26th of August 2001. The Tampa defied Australia and steamed into the waters off Christmas Island on the 30th of August 2001. We went into court and the trial started on the Friday night, ran Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The judge adjourned to consider his decision on Wednesday the 5th of September 2001, and by a stroke of awful chronological coincidence, he delivered judgment at 2:15 in the afternoon Melbourne time on the 11th of September 2001. The next morning, you may not have noticed that we won at first instance. Barristers need to remember these things. We lost 2 days on appeal, 2 days later on appeal, but you wouldn't have noticed it because, of course, overnight the attack on America had happened and the world changed. And that's when Howard started calling boat people illegals. Because after September 11, it was not possible to say anything that might be seen as favourable to Muslims, because after September 11, the prevailing rhetoric was, there aren't just Muslims, there's only Muslim terrorists, and there aren't just boat people, there's only Muslim boat people, and they're suspected terrorists, and they're illegal, and they're queue jumpers, and so on it goes. But while it is Howard and latterly Abbott and Morrison who have persisted in that rhetoric and have gradually degraded public thinking on the subject in Australia, Labor never contradicted it. Labor has never stood up authoritatively, either in opposition or in government, and said it's a lie. They are not illegal. They do not break any law. The one thing that might change the narrative in Australia is for the Labor Party to stand in a position of authority and say the illegal thing is a lie. But they haven't done it. The other symbol, I suppose, of Labor's thoroughly compromised stand on the treatment of asylum seekers is the fact that Richard Marles is now the Shadow Minister for Immigration, and he is hopeless on the subject, absolutely hopeless. If Labor was serious about this, Melissa Park would be the Shadow Minister. So, that's the first reason that I am not happy to be here launching this book, because the name of the book has been subverted in order to allow a little bit more room for the compromised policies that the Labor Party has had at least since 2001, probably longer. But the second reason is that the book is necessary at all. Why is it necessary to have a book that talks about the way the drownings have been exploited? The drownings excuse has gone through some interesting phases And the way it works is roughly this. First of all, we had rhetoric from Abbott and then picked up mightily by Rudd, saying that the asylum seekers were shocking people. I think Rudd called them the scum of the earth, the lowest of the low, they should rot in hell. Forgetting, of course, that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, his moral hero, was also a people smuggler. Forgetting that Schindler was a people smuggler, and we all kind of liked him in the film and the book. Forgetting that Gustav Schroeder was a people smuggler, but he was a moral hero by any standards. Gustav Schroeder, you all know about Gustav Schroeder, the St. Louis, left Hamburg in May of 1939 with a cargo of 900 Jews seeking to escape Germany. He pulled every trick in the book. He broke every rule that was possible, trying to get them somewhere safe. He ended up trying to put them ashore at Cuba. The Cubans wouldn't have him. He was warned off at gunpoint on the Florida coast. The Americans didn't want them. He ended up going back to Europe and putting them ashore in Antwerp. A few months later, when the Low Countries were overrun, more than half of those people died in concentration camps. Gustav Schroeder was a people smuggler who tried to save 900 Jews. Then and now, he was a hero. And you may hate people smugglers, you may detest their profit motive, those who have a profit motive, but they are providing something which is needed. They are actually the path by which desperate people may be saved. Now, I don't applaud their callousness, those of them who are callous, but read Robin de Crepney's book, The People Smuggler. Ali Al-Janabi sounds like a pretty decent guy. Now, allowing that there's a bit of glossing, he still sounds like a pretty decent guy, and there is no doubt that the people who have been saved from persecution by the efforts of people smugglers are grateful to their people smugglers. I've met lots and lots of boat people in Australia. I've never heard one of them complain about their people smuggler. By the time Abbott became the leader of the coalition, it was a bit unrespectable to bag asylum seekers themselves. We had gradually figured out that these were terrified Hazaras fleeing the Taliban. These were terrified Iranians fleeing the theocratic madmen in Iran. People fleeing Saddam Hussein. I mean, how can you decide to bomb Iraq and say people who are escaping the bombing are terrible, bad people? You know, it's kind of different. So the attack was an attack on the people smugglers, a much softer target. The drowning excuse began when the boat smashed to bits off the shore of Christmas Island. It was an appalling sight. No one could fail to be moved by seeing that awful slow-motion death of so many people. And so Stop the Boats was initially stop the drownings. The point of it was to stop the drownings. But it gradually morphed. And you'll notice that recently the coalition government have said, we stopped the boats. What that means is we stopped them from arriving. Well, all but one of them, but let's say they've stopped them. But we know they haven't stopped them setting out. We know they haven't stopped them setting out because we have intruded onto Indonesian territorial waters at least half a dozen times in order to force boats back. We've bought millions of dollars worth of fancy lifeboats in order to send people back. We don't know how many people have drowned because that's an on-water matter and we're not allowed to know. We have not stopped the boats in the sense that it originally meant. We haven't stopped the drowning so far as we are aware. We certainly haven't dissuaded people from chancing their arm in a way that I suspect most of us will chance our arm if we're unlucky enough to be in their shoes. Think about this. People fleeing, the boat people typically come from that corner to our northwest. Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and they come down through Malaysia and Indonesia. They haven't signed a convention. They offer no protection. People come down that way. They can get in because you can get a 1-month visa on entry, as you all know if you've travelled there. But after 1 month, you are genuinely illegal. After 1 month, you risk being arrested if you're found. After 1 month, you have to live in the shadows, or else you'll find yourself in a filthy Indonesian jail. So, you can go into the UNHCR office in Jakarta, of course. You can ask for refugee status, of course. Many people do it and they get a document from the UNHCR office in Jakarta saying, yes, you're a refugee. I mean, if you're a Hazara from Afghanistan, it's about a 99.9% likelihood that you are a refugee. That's kind of easy. So, then what do? Well, after the 1 month, even though you've got that piece of paper from the UNHCR, you cannot get a job, because if you get a job, you'll be found. If you're found, you'll be jailed. You can't send your kids to school, because if you send your kids to school, you'll be found, and if you're found, you'll be jailed, and they'll be jailed, and it's miserable. So what can you do? You can wait for a country to offer to resettle you. How long will that take? Well, on current figures, between 20 and 30 years. Or you can chance your arm and risk your life using a people smuggler on a boat. Is there anyone in this room who wouldn't do that? Anyone at all? What is it about this country that it's a measure of political success that you criticise and abuse the people who act exactly as we would act if we were in their shoes? It is at the very least a grotesque failure of our imagination. It's supported by grotesque dishonesty from our politicians, who keep on telling us these people are illegals when they're not. The other catastrophic element of our current policy is this. It started off, as I say, as an attempt to stop people drowning. But what do? We punish the ones who don't drown. It's a rare inversion of logic that the people, the victims who survive the voyage are the ones who get punished. I don't know how anyone can explain that. What happens to them? They get brutalised from the time they set foot in Christmas Island until the time, if ever, that they leave Nauru or Manus Island. Let me give you an instance. Christmas Island. I have a number of statements from people, doctors, working on Christmas Island. When people arrive on Christmas Island, they've typically been at sea for 8 or 10 days. Most of them are people who've never seen the ocean before, let alone been on the ocean. They are traumatised by the experience. They've typically had not enough to eat or drink. They've typically had no opportunity to wash or change their clothes. They typically arrive weary, desperate, frightened, wearing clothes caked in their own excrement. They are not allowed the dignity of an opportunity to wash and change before they're interviewed by officers of the Immigration Department. In those degrading circumstances, it's then decided whether they'll be sent to Nauru or Manus, or whether they'll be held on Christmas Island for a time for further inquiries to be made. When they are processed, any medication they've got on them is taken. One person has a full-time job, sitting in front of a rubbish bin, popping pills out of blister packs for later destruction. If they have any medical documentation, it is confiscated. If they have any medical appliances like prosthetic limbs, spectacles, hearing aids and the like, those are confiscated and not returned. The net effect of this is to humiliate them and degrade them in every living moment of their existence after that. One of the doctors there told me of a woman. She had been on Christmas Island for a few weeks, and the prevailing view was that this woman was insane. No one could understand the problem. Her behaviour was right off the edge. So this doctor said she wanted to interview the woman to work out what was wrong. The interview was difficult because the woman didn't speak English and the doctor didn't speak, I think it was Iranian. So they had an interviewer, but the interviewer was not at the table with them. The interviewer was at the other end of the telephone speaking from Sydney. It took some time for the doctor to work out that this woman's problem was that she was incontinent of urine. She had had her original clothes taken from her and had been reissued with clothes but no underwear, and she couldn't leave her room without having urine running down her leg, and that was driving her mad. The doctor told immigration this woman needed incontinence pads. Their initial response was, "We don't do those." She insisted. They eventually agreed to provide 4 per day, which apparently is not enough. She has to queue up for more. That was the way we are treating people who've done nothing at all wrong apart from coming and asking for our help, asking for protection. This is what happens on Christmas Island. They then, if they're unlucky, they're sent to Nauru or to Manus Island. Manus Island, everyone knows what happened to Reza Verity on the 17th of February last year. Interesting that it's a year and 2 days since he was killed, No one has yet been taken before a court. It was months before anyone was charged. But 2 weeks after Reza Verity was killed, I received some sworn witness statements. One of them was an eyewitness account of Verity's death. He said, initially, you may recall, Scott Morrison dishonestly said Verity had escaped from detention and was killed by locals outside the detention centre. He had to recant. And the statement that I received said that Reza Verity was in the camp running and trying to get back into his room where he could escape the violence that was happening. He was approached by one of the guards who had a 2 metre long plank of timber with 2 long nails driven through it. The nails were sticking out at the far end. He brought 2 blows down on Reza Verity's head, lacerating his scalp terribly. Verity had blood all over his head and fell to the ground. 10 to 15 guards, including 2 Australians, rushed up to him and started kicking him in the stomach and in the head. He tried to protect himself. One of the guards, and this witness statement names these people, one of the guards then picked up a rock and brought it down savagely on Verity's head, killing him. And he said, I knew he was dead because when they kicked him after that, he didn't flinch. Now, that statement had not been provided to the Papua New Guinea police by the time Robert Cornwall went over there on behalf of the Australian government to make a report on the incident. That was in June, so 4 months had gone past without those witness statements being provided to the PNG police. So far, as I say, despite what is clearly a cold-blooded killing, it's very hard to see what defence there is to that bit of murder. No one has faced a court. And of course it suits Australia very well for people to live in dread of the idea that they might end up on Manus Island, where they'll be tormented by the appalling conditions and face the risk of dying for lack of medical treatment, like Hamid Karzai, or murdered, like Reza Verity.